Welcome back to another episode of Curiosity, Not Judgment. My name is Birga.
And I'm Gary.
Thinking today about an inner circle. And I know that I've got certain people in my life that I really depend on for guidance and honest feedback. But I know that that's not something that everybody necessarily experiences or has access to. And so I wanted to talk about that concept a little bit today, and who comprises your inner circle, and what happens when you start to get guidance and influence from those outside of your circle, and what do you do with that?
It's an interesting topic. You know, everyone should have a group of advisors, an inner circle. We've talked before about how, my thoughts are going to be, by definition, a little off track, and many perspectives often bring clarity and better thinking around. There's a group of folks that had their own advisory team, so to speak, that came out of the Napoleon Hill days, where people had this. They didn't call it an inner circle, but it was an advisory group. They're something mind, something. Anyway, it was a mind group that would help them think through issues, because we don't have all the perspective. We are sometimes in the woods, and we need the perspective from outside the trees, so to speak, and other things. So in your personal life and your business life, you ought to have a group of trusted advisors that you run things by. Your question, though, was what happens when you get influenced or caught up with something that's from outside your inner circle or your advisory group, and that is, one of the purposes of an inner circle is to test those things, right? If you have people who are your inner circle, and the criteria to me would be people who are for you, people who aren't going to just tell you can't do things just to do that, and people who don't have agendas that are counter to your purposes or your goals, right? So
I would add one more of those. You don't want just yes people in there.
No, definitely not. You want people who think differently than you.
That will challenge
Otherwise, one of you is unnecessary.
Yeah.
And will challenge you, right? That high support, high challenge principle from Giant Worldwide that we've talked about. So you certainly want diversity of opinion, but you want people who are for you.
Yes.
Because if you have people who have their own agendas, who aren't for you, who want different goals than you have, in general, then that can take you off track as you're looking for other thinking.
Yep. So this concept kind of dawned on me this morning as I was at the gym and listening to another podcast talking about that concept of having an inner circle of advisors. And I don't think I've ever thought about it that formally. I have those people that I will go to for advice when something happens, but I didn't necessarily see it as a team. Like, okay, team, it's time to meet. Here's my problem. Let's discuss. Ready, go. And I don't know that that's maybe a necessity, but it's a different way of approaching it than telling your story repeatedly to one person and then another and getting different ideas. And there is something around that concept of having that kind of advisory board where you are together discussing a problem, an opportunity, whatever it is that's before you. And so I was kind of intrigued by that. And I know that we've got a mutual friend who always suggests having an advisory board in addition to a board of directors.
Right.
Those two groups having a very distinctive purpose. And when it comes to our personal lives, maybe it's not a business endeavor or around an organization, it's just us trying to manage us. Do we still have that same level of advisory board or inner circle, and how does that function? What might it look like when it's operating in a healthy manner?
It's interesting you say that, because I think that very few people have in their personal life a group of people that they come to on a regular basis and get together in their personal life and say, here's what I'm thinking about for my life. And there's 4 or 5 people sitting around a table going, maybe that's not the best decision for you, or maybe you're a little off track. And I think it's interesting because we do often think of it from a business standpoint in 3 ways, really. There's the board of directors, as you said. There's an advisory board, and that mutual friend that we have, I'm on his advisory board. But there's also groups of people that can advise you that with specific expertises. I remember one of the major things that I thought when I did a startup company that was a small business with a group of friends. We had a board of directors, we had an advisory board, but I also had an accountant, a lawyer, and a banker that I would get with once a year, at least, those three together and say, here's my vision for next year. And there was a lot of interaction between, well, okay, my accountant would say, well, then you'd have to set up your companies in this way. And then my banker would say, well, if you set up your companies in this way, then I can do loans or lines of credit in this way as a result. Anyway, so I think there's three different kind of factors. There's the ones you call together that are a kind of a board of directors that have fiscal responsibility to the company and the shareholders. You have the advisory board, which is different expertise from different industries and different thoughts that you want to get just for diversity of thought to make sure you're not missing something. And then there's that specific specialized skill board together. But it's interesting that I can lay that out for business. Personal? No, if I'm going to go buy electronics, I'm going to call my friend Brian, who does extreme research on that stuff. If it's a matter with family, I might call, this person. If it's a person. So you're right. I think we don't do that in our personal lives. You think it's a good idea?
I'm starting to.
Yeah.
We've had a series of events that have happened over the course of the last 6 or so months, and I wonder how decision-making would be impacted if we were to have kind of that roundtable discussion all at once with the folks that I value their voice and their feedback. Say, all right, team, here's what I'm facing. What do you think? And what would that look like? And perhaps it doesn't happen because that's an extra demand on time. You are definitely pulling in, people that you most value, and I think you're probably more protective of their time than you would be somebody affiliated with a business.
Right.
And so, I don't know. I'm just finding myself being curious around the concept of having that kind of personal Knights of the Round Table, around my life, but finding that the thought of that is highly appealing.
It's interesting. I did have this, there was this one doctor friend of mine, and we got together with, and we kind of handpicked a group of people who were kind of leaders in their own field, and we went down to Vernon's Steakhouse and had a dinner. And at the end of the dinner, what we did was we went around the table and we said, here's an aspect of my life that I need some help in. And then each person did that. And it turns out that, and then we went around the room again, and we said, pick one of the things that you've heard and speak into this person from your own experience. And that was really powerful. As a matter of fact, I need to call my friend and see if we should do that again, because our lives have totally radically changed since then. But that was kind of cool.
Well, if you have an extra seat at the table, let me know.
Yeah. Well, no, I would do that. But that's a way of doing it, where it's not just you and you've gathered this group of friends just to talk about your issue. You could say, let's go around the room and talk about something that you're dealing with in your own life. And then each person goes around and speaks into that. And what was shocking to me, because I thought at first, is this going to be a stochastic, is this going to be a highly variable event or an unpredictable event? It turns out, and just luck of the draw, that every single person's problem was addressed by another person. It wasn't like a double up. Like three people wanted to do this and nobody spoke into that. And I thought that was interesting also.
Coincidence? Perhaps not.
Perhaps not.
So if we have this concept of, trusted voices, whether we call it our inner circle or it's something a little bit more formal, and those are people that we rely on to challenge us, to encourage us, to really speak into our life, and then you get an outside voice that really shakes or rattles you, how much credit do you give that voice? And, we had this conversation right before we started recording, and you immediately say, well, none. But easier said than done.
Right.
We have discussed this. I'm a people pleaser. You skew that way as well. So if you've got somebody that's outside of your circle that says something to you, it can drastically affect your frame of mind.
Yeah. And my reaction of none is kind of trying to preach to myself as I shouldn't. But the fact of the matter is it has great influence on me in general. But I think you could evaluate that. One, is it a missing part of your normal inner circle, right? Because the way you're saying it, it's a different thing than you would think than your inner circle would come up with or advise.
Yeah, it's the outlier,
It's
right?
the outlier. And then, and then as we talked about, should it be tested against that inner circle? Or is it a missing aspect of that inner circle that needs to be added to? How do you get every single perspective in the world into an inner circle, right? That's very difficult.
Yeah.
I would always look at that and say, okay, here's this outlier. Is it an outlier that I need to consider? Or is it an outlier that I can consider and say, yeah, that's true, but it doesn't need to affect any of my decision making? Or is it an outlier that is something that is I should just dismiss?
Yeah.
How do you make that determination?
Well, we had talked, I think it was last week, and my conversations with you are running together a little bit in my mind, but I think we've spoken at some point at least about having to earn the trust of someone to be able to speak into their life in a particular way.
Sure.
And so if it's someone that doesn't know you well and you don't have a lot of trust built in that relationship, if that individual is going to speak something negative or, that outlier, so to speak, element into your life, it does cause that friction point, but it also causes you to evaluate it a little bit differently than if that same comment were coming from somebody that was more trusted.
Absolutely. So, and trust can come in many ways, right?
Mm-hmm.
Trust can come from a profound knowledge of the person, like you and I would have, because
Mm-hmm.
we've known each other for many years. Trust can also come because you've heard a number of comments from that person that really jive with you and or jive and help you grow. In other words, okay, what this person has laid out is something that, yeah, that looks like it matches my way of thinking, but he's added an extra element, or she has said something that has caused me to think a little bit different and to grow in a different way that I hadn't thought about before. I think we can develop trust with people who we listen to, even on a podcast. We don't know the person well, but we hear what they're saying, we identify with it, and yet it's also adding value to me.
Yeah. What about if it's not just a stretching comment? What if it's a condemning or a critical comment?
Yeah, and so critical in again, I'm going to talk about critical in a couple of different ways, right? Critical can mean something that's just mean for no reason. Critical can be something that I should deeply consider because this is something that maybe I want to change the way I'm doing things, my approach, my actions, my motivations, my thinking. Or it could be critical in the way that you're using the word that is just, it's critical and I can't or won't deal with it right now. And so of those categories, what are we talking about? Is it something that you just never heard before and you need to think about and process? Or is it something you've heard all your life and figure, nothing I can do about it? Or is it something that was just said that was just mean and not appropriate for the situation?
Yeah. Well, I think those are questions that we have to ask in the moment, and I think every situation is going to vary tremendously. And so what about those people that don't really have that advisory board or that inner circle? What might be some ways in which we approach people to begin to build that trusted relationship, to begin to form that closeness and ability to say, hey, I would love for you to speak into my life?
Yeah, and short of asking for a mentor, asking for somebody who, this doesn't have to be formal. You should have a few people in your life. Remember, we've talked about this before. You should have one person in your life that you can say anything to, that you're totally honest to, and we've talked about that before. An author that I read that really made the statement that if you don't have someone that you can be completely honest with, then you're stuck and you're never going to grow. And I know that sounds a little radical, but in my experience, it's true. Then you have that next level of people that you don't say everything to. They don't know everything about you because it's just not necessary. And for that kind of a relationship, it's not that you're withholding anything, it's just that the context is not necessary for the relationship, and yet you have a good enough relationship that when things come, things that happen in the world to you together, that you can discuss it, and you trust each other enough. Then you've got ever evolving circles. So those circles of people that on a casual basis, you kind of you can have a casual conversation with about anything, and you're not going to, one's not going to be radically different than the other. And then, out to the people that you just have transactions with, or the people that you have arguments with continuously on Twitter or Facebook these days, right? Whether or not you respect them. And so I think there's this ever evolving circle, but you should have that one person that you can talk to about anything. Then you should have that group of people around that you can bounce ideas off of. Because sometimes we think or say things that we don't even believe, right? At least I do. I should use I statements. I sometimes say things, and as they're coming out of my mouth, I'm going, I'm not even sure I believe that. And and if you've got people around you that will call that out and say, "Really, Gary, you believe that?" Nah, I really don't. Right? And that I think that's really necessary, because if I just listen to the thousands of voices in my own head, I can get myself in trouble.
You used a phrase that I think is worth discussing for a few moments about that evolving circle. And I think there are times that there's going to be natural ebb and flow of people in and out of your life.
Sure.
And maybe it has to do with a geographic location. Maybe you're very involved in local politics, and your core group of people that you need to bounce things off of need to be in your community. And if you've got a dear friend that had been in your circle but has moved away and is no longer involved, maybe they're not your go-to person anymore for this particular brand of conversation. And I think just as seasons happen, and somebody may have gone through an extreme period of pain where they're kind of shut down, and you can't burden them with the things that are going on in your life because they just can't handle it. I think it does kind of grow and shrink over time depending on just life circumstances and the people in your life.
Absolutely true. And so these 5 seconds in this chapter, in this season of your life, what's important. And sometimes you might have somebody who has been critical for you up until this point, and then you need to change, right? For a variety of reasons. I thought a very empathetic one that you just brought up is that person just has so much going on in their own lives they can't even handle more stuff anymore right now, and they just need to deal with that. And that might be, you talked about ebb and flow of people. There might be an ebb and flow in the relationship, where someone's really leaning on you, and then in the next season you're leaning on them.
Right.
So I think that's absolutely true. But I think the key is that there's someone.
Yeah.
The key is that there's a group of people. There's that one person, then there's those 3 people, then those 7 people, then those 12, then those, whatever. That we all have those emanating circles, so to speak. Because I think without that, we diminish our own lives. We are not living to our full potential. We actually cause ourselves to shrink, grow, or be stagnant.
I would hope for married people that their spouse is the one with whom they can be fully transparent, fully honest with. But there's a whole lot of single people out there that don't have that other to be that intimate partner and voice and sounding board for them. And so finding somebody trusted when you're single, I could imagine that's a big challenge as well.
Yeah, especially if you are looking to court a spouse at some point, and that person is of the opposite sex, and how do you keep that to be a friendship, and how do you get that to be, how do you nurture that? And those are the kind of things that just take work. And I think that this gets back into our overall relationships, and how many do we want to have? These are the curious questions. What are we willing to put into that? Because I think, we've got to be able to pick up the phone and call and say, hey, can you get a cup of coffee this
Yeah.
week? Do you have some time this week where we can sit and discuss and share a cookie at Flying Star or whatever? Because if we don't put the work into it, then those it'll be like a muscle, it'll atrophy, it'll go away, and we all know that based on where they are in those series of circles. I've got this visualization in my mind right now. The easier it is to talk to somebody is the more that you've talked to them. I've got one grandchild who I talk to every week because of a certain situation that they're in, and it's very easy for us to have a conversation about anything because we know so much
Right.
of what's going on. We have a context,
Yeah.
right? And so I think that's it takes work, and this is sometimes I find that I have a hard time putting the work into relationships these days with all the other demands in my life. But if you are single and you don't have a spouse or someone that you're constantly doing that, what I think you don't want to do is get into a situation where you're isolating and you don't have anybody around to bounce things off of. And I think that's where we can get in trouble.
Yeah. And I think it goes back to nurturing relationships, as we've talked about in other podcasts, and really building up that rapport and trust and all of those things. I think the last thing I'll touch on real briefly is what happens when just the dynamic of a trusted relationship changes. You don't want it to, but it just does, and you have to replace that voice with somebody else.
That's tough. And there's a lot in there,
Sure.
what you just asked. But, first of all, is the relationship worth salvaging? Did the thing that happened or did you just grow apart, or what's gone on with that? Is that relationship worth salvaging? Because I hate to put it in these terms, but it's like an employee, right? You've invested a lot in that person, and if they leave, you've got to build that whole thing all over again. That's a cost to the organization. So same thing here. It will be a cost. There will be some upfront and front-loaded effort that will be necessary to form that new relationship. And I think we sometimes, if we lose a relationship like that, I think of, wow, there's a lot of reasons why I don't want to put that much effort into something right now in my life.
Yeah.
Do I have the time?
Right.
So I think nurturing the current relationships and being in a place where if something occurs, and hopefully the relationship will stand that, that you've built that bridge that will withstand
Right.
that issue. But if it doesn't, then don't get lazy and say, well, if that relationship didn't work, it's not worth me putting the effort into another one.
Right. Yeah. Don't go back to self-isolating and being an army of one. Yeah. Really good things to ponder, and I certainly hope we've given you some questions to chew on in the week ahead as you stay curious. So, as always, we welcome your feedback. Curiosity.judgement.com is the website and the best way to reach us. So we'll wish you a great week, and we'll catch up next time.
Take care.